The old barn at the edge of Millhaven Road had been falling apart for years, and everyone in town knew it. Everyone except the 11-year-old girl who cut through its shadow every morning on her way to school. Because for Nora, wait, her name was Clem. Clementine Ray Sutton, though nobody called her that except her teacher on the first day of school each September, when Mrs. Halverson would work through the attendance sheet and pause just a little too long at the hyphenated last name. Clem didn't mind. She was used to pauses, used to people taking an extra second to figure out where she fit. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark eyes that took in more than she ever said out loud. She lived with her grandfather, Bud, in a two-bedroom house on the far side of Millhaven, Ontario, in the part of town where the sidewalks ended and the gravel began. Bud was 68 and walked with a cane he'd carved himself from a branch that had come down in an ice storm 3 winters ago. He didn't complain about his hip. He didn't complain about much. That was something Clem had learned from him without either of them ever saying it directly, that complaining didn't fill the fridge, and filling the fridge was what mattered. Every morning that autumn, Clem walked the long way to school because the shortcut through Millhaven Road passed by the old Aldermere barn, and she liked the barn. She couldn't explain why, exactly. It was half collapsed, its weathered boards gone grey as driftwood, the roof caved in on the east side, where a tree had fallen through it sometime in the 90s. People drove past it without looking. Clem always looked. That particular Tuesday in October, she looked harder than usual. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that arrived early in that part of Ontario, slipping in off Lake Huron before the calendar said it was allowed. Clem had on her grandfather's old wool sweater over her school hoodie, the sleeves pushed up because they were too long, and she was moving fast, her breath a small cloud ahead of her. She heard it before she saw anything, a sound. Low, somewhere between a groan and a knock, the kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to be heard and don't have much left to try with. Clem stopped. The barn was 50 feet off the road, behind a rusted wire fence that had been down in the same spot for as long as she could remember. She stood very still and listened. It came again. She went over the fence. The ground inside was soft, the grass gone long and yellow with the season, and she moved carefully because there were old boards with nails in them, and she'd learned that lesson the hard way 2 years ago. She crossed to the barn's main doors, which were half open, hanging at an angle, and she stepped inside. The light came in through the collapsed roof in long slanted bars, and dust moved slowly in it, and the smell was old wood and damp earth and something else, something that didn't belong. A car. There was a car inside the barn. Not an old junked one, not the kind of rusted hull you sometimes found on old properties. This was a dark blue sedan, newer, the kind of car that looked wrong in a place like this, the same way a good coat looked wrong on a clothesline in November. Clem stood very still. The sound came again, from the back of the car, from the trunk. She walked toward it slowly, the way you walk toward something when your brain was telling your legs to be careful, even as your feet kept moving. "Hello?" she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. A thud, definite, controlled. Someone was hitting the inside of the trunk from the inside. "Is someone in there?" Another thud. 3 fast ones, then a pause, then 3 more. Like a pattern, like someone who knew what they were doing. Clem looked at the trunk release. There was no button, no external lever. She looked at the gap where the lid met the body and saw that it was sealed shut from inside. She could see the scratch marks near the latch where someone had tried to work it from within and failed. "I'm going to find something," she said to whoever was in there. "Hold on." She was not the kind of girl who panicked. Bud had raised her with a deep and practical steadiness that had come, she understood later, from decades of a man learning to hold himself together through things that would have come apart someone else. She searched the barn and found a rusted tire iron under a collapsed shelf in 3 minutes. She worked the latch with it in another 2, the irons slipping twice, her hands shaking slightly from the cold and the effort, and then the trunk gave with a pop and swung upward. The man inside blinked against the light. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, she would guess later, though she didn't think about his age in that moment. What she saw was that his hands were bound with zip ties, there was a strip of tape across his mouth, and his face had blood on it, dried, dark, from a cut above his eyebrow. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. He was shaking. She reached for the tape before she thought about it, and he flinched and she stopped. "Sorry," she said. Can I take it off?" "The tape?" He nodded. She did it carefully, pulling from the edge, the way Bud had taught her to remove bandages. The man exhaled like he'd been holding that breath since Tuesday last week. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough. "Thank you." His name was Foster. Foster Crane. She didn't know that yet. She only knew that his hands were turning blue from the zip ties and she needed to get them off, and that he was too large to get out of the trunk on his own, and that she was 11 years old and weighed 82 pounds, and this was going to take some thinking. Foster Crane had been, until 36 hours earlier, the kind of man who didn't think much about his own vulnerability. He was 54, 6'1", the sort of person who had built a company from a single timber yard in Sudbury into a regional construction materials operation that employed 412 people across northern Ontario. He was not a man who scared easily. He was not a man who expected to find himself in a barn. He had been taken from the parking garage below his office on Sunday evening, 2 men. Professional, efficient, unhurried. The kind of professional efficiency that told him immediately that this was not random. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew his schedule, knew which car he drove, knew the parking garage's camera blind spot. He had tried in the first hours to stay calm and think. He'd worked the zip ties until his wrists were raw. He'd mapped the sounds, highway, then gravel road, then nothing, then a barn door. He'd estimated distance. He'd counted hours by the change in temperature through the trunk metal. He'd done everything a sensible, controlled person could do. And then, at some point in the second night, lying in that dark with his wrists numb and his mouth taped and the cold seeping through the car floor, he had thought about his daughter. He had thought about Rosalind, who was 26 and lived in Vancouver now, who called on Sundays, who had her mother's eyes and his stubborn streak, and who he had been, for many years, not nearly good enough to. He'd been building the business when she was small. He'd been on job sites, in meetings, on planes. He'd missed school plays and birthday dinners and the time she broke her arm falling off the monkey bars in grade 4, and the teacher had called his office and he hadn't answered because he was in a contract negotiation. He had lain in that trunk and thought, "If I get out of this, I am going to call her." Then the latch had given, and light had come in, and there was a child. Small, dark-eyed, holding a tire iron in both hands, and looking at him with an expression that was grave and practical, and entirely without panic, and it was one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen. The zip ties came off with a pair of wire cutters she found on the barn wall. She'd had the foresight to look while he worked on getting his legs under him. He sat on the edge of the trunk for a few minutes, breathing, while she stood nearby and didn't pepper him with questions, which he appreciated more than he could have said. "How long?" she asked finally. "Since Sunday night." She looked at him steadily. "Do you have a phone?" They took it. She pulled one from her hoodie pocket. It was old, the screen cracked in the corner, the case held together with a strip of electrical tape. She held it out to him. "You should call someone," she said. "The police, probably." He took the phone. His hands were not entirely steady. He dialed 911 first, gave his name and location. She told him, Millhaven, the old Aldermere barn on Millhaven Road, and then he sat with the phone in his lap while the dispatcher kept him on the line, and he looked at this girl who had found him with a tire iron and wire cutters and the most unsentimental competence he'd ever encountered in a child or most adults. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clem," she said. "Clementine Sutton." "What's yours?" "Foster," he said. "Foster Crane." She didn't react to the name the way most people in the region did. No flicker of recognition, no slight straightening of posture. He found that interesting. "You live nearby?" he asked. "About 20 minutes on foot." She glanced toward the barn door, back to him. "I'm supposed to be at school, I know. I'm sorry." "It's okay," she said, in a tone that suggested she had calculated this and found it acceptable. This seemed more important. The police came in 14 minutes. After them came an ambulance, and after that, a particular kind of organized chaos that Foster had enough experience of the world to know how to move through. The questions, the forms, the careful recorded statements, the hospital visit for the cut above his eyebrow which needed 4 stitches. Through all of it, he kept track of where Clem was. She had been collected by a female officer who sat with her in the back of a cruiser with the heat on, and Foster could see through the window that she was answering questions in the same steady way she'd spoken in the barn. She'd called Bud from his phone before the police arrived. He'd heard her side of it. "Grandpa, I'm going to be late." "No, I'm fine. I found someone in the barn on Millhaven Road." "No, I'll explain later." "Can you call the school?" A pause. "I said I'm fine, Grandpa." Another pause. "I know, I will. Bye." She'd ended the call and handed the phone back to Foster without further comment. At the hospital, while they were cleaning up his wrist lacerations, a detective named Hadley came in and told him they had a person of interest. An employee he'd let go 3 months ago, a man named Darnell Morrow, who'd had access to the parking garage schedule, and who had been, it turned out, holding a considerable grudge. The investigation was moving. Foster should know they took this seriously. Foster thanked him. He sat with that name, Darnell Morrow, and felt the specific cold anger of a man who had been wronged and was processing what to do with it. Morrow had worked in the timber yard accounting department for 11 years. Foster remembered signing off on the termination, not a performance issue, a restructuring. The whole department consolidated into the company's regional office. He had not attended the exit meetings himself. He'd signed the paperwork. That was how he'd operated. Efficient. Clean. From a distance. He thought about that, in the hospital room, while they bandaged his wrists. He thought about Clem. He thought about how she'd found him by chance, or maybe not by chance. She walked that road every morning, she'd told him, because she liked the barn. A child who liked old things, who stopped to listen when the world made a sound that didn't belong. He didn't know why that particular detail lodged itself somewhere below his sternum and stayed there. He called Rosalind that evening, from his own phone, from his own home, where he had taken the longest shower of his life and changed his clothes and stood in his kitchen for a few minutes doing nothing, except being grateful for the familiar dimensions of the room. "Dad." Her voice, when she picked up, was alarmed. Someone had already called her, he realized. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm okay," he said. "I'm home. I'm fine. I heard they said you were taken. I know. I'm sorry. I should have had someone call you sooner." A silence. Then she said carefully, "Are you actually fine? Because you can just say if you're not." And Foster, who was very good at saying he was fine when he wasn't, looked at his kitchen and his bandaged wrists and thought of a barn and a child with a tire iron. "I'm working on it," he said. "Okay," Rosalind said. "That's actually better." They talked for an hour and a half. He couldn't remember the last time they'd talked for an hour and a half. The following week, Foster drove to Millhaven. He had the address from the police report. Clem had been listed as a witness, with her grandfather's permission, and Bud Sutton's address was on Garrett Lane, the gravel road part of town. Foster found the house without trouble. A small white bungalow with a rusted metal carport and a garden that had been, he could tell, very carefully tended through the summer and was now being put to bed for the winter with the kind of methodical attention that spoke of a person who valued their plants enough to do it right. Bud Sutton answered the door. He was a tall man, lean, with a face that had weathered into its planes and a handshake that was firm and brief. He looked at Foster the way men of his generation looked at people they were assessing, directly, without particular warmth or hostility, just a clear taking of measure. "You're the one she found," Bud said. "Yes, sir," Foster said. "I wanted to thank her. And you." Bud was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The inside of the house was small and clean and full of the kind of detail that told you how people actually lived. Clem's school backpack hung on a hook by the door, with one strap repaired, with what appeared to be a zip tie. A library book on the kitchen table. Bud's cane leaning against the counter. On the fridge, held by a magnet shaped like a moose, was a drawing in pencil of what appeared to be the inside of a barn, seen from ground level, with light coming in through a broken roof. Foster stood and looked at it. "That's the Aldermere barn," Clem said. She was at the kitchen table with a glass of milk and a worksheet she'd been doing, and she looked at him the same way she'd looked at him from the trunk, measured, calm, taking stock. "I drew it last spring. Before any of this, it's good," Foster said. He meant it. She considered that. "I know. I want to be an architect, or maybe an engineer. I haven't decided." Bud had put the kettle on. He moved around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of a man who cooked every meal himself and had developed systems. Foster sat at the table. "How are your wrists?" Clem asked. "Healing," he said. "How are you?" After everything, "I'm fine," she said. "I've thought about it and I'd do it the same way again." He almost smiled. "That's what I expected." Bud set 2 mugs on the table. He didn't ask if Foster wanted tea, he just made it. That was something else Foster recognized. The hospitality of people who didn't have excess but offered what they had without calling attention to the offering. They talked for a while. Clem told him about school, about the architecture section of the library that she'd read through twice, and was now requesting additional books from the regional system. She told him that her grandfather had built the carport himself in 1987 from plans he'd found in a magazine, and that she thought it was structurally interesting, even though it was ugly. Bud made a sound that was not quite a laugh. When Foster was leaving, standing in the door with his coat on, he turned and said, "Not rehearsed, not strategic, just the thought he'd been carrying since the hospital. If you ever want to see a real building site, I run a company that does material supply for construction. I could take you to a project we're working on. You could see how the structure goes up." Clem looked at Bud. Bud looked at Foster. That measuring look again. "She's 11, he said. "I know," Foster said. "I'd keep her safe." "I know you would," Bud said after a moment, "or you wouldn't be standing in my door." He looked at Clem. "Up to you, sweetheart." Clem said yes. The site visit happened on a Saturday in early November, a mixed-use development in Goderich that Foster's company was supplying with engineered lumber. He picked Clem up at 9 in the morning, Bud standing on the porch with his cane and his coat, and watching the car pull away with an expression that contained, Foster thought, more trust than he'd done anything yet to earn. He felt the weight of that trust. He intended to deserve it. The site foreman, a woman named Pat, who had been in construction for 30 years and had the particular quality of someone who tolerated nothing and respected competence above all else, gave Clem the full tour. Clem asked questions that made Pat stop and look at her twice. Not simple questions, but the kind that built on the previous answer, that arriving at the next logical query. And arriving at the next logical... "You read about load-bearing systems?" Pat asked her halfway through. "I read what I could find," Clem said. "Our library is small." Pat looked at Foster. He shrugged slightly, which she understood. On the drive home, Clem was quiet for the first 20 minutes in the way of a person absorbing information, not a person with nothing to say. Then she said, "The cantilever on the east side will be a problem in 10 years. Foster glanced at her. "What makes you think that?" "The soil report was in the site office. I read it while you were talking to Pat. The clay content at the east station is higher than the west. They'll get differential settling." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're going to be very good at this." She looked out the window. "I know," she said, "but not with arrogance, with the particular certainty of a person who has assessed themselves honestly and arrived at a true conclusion." Winter came to Millhaven with the usual blunt force of a Lake Huron winter, and Foster found himself driving the highway to Garrett Lane more often than he had initially planned. He brought things, always with a reason, a set of architectural reference books that were sitting unused at his office, a box of Timbits because he was passing a Tim's anyway, a report from one of his project architects who had agreed, after some persuasion, to write Clem a letter about what her actual schooling path should look like. He wasn't entirely sure, in the early months, what he was doing. He only knew that it felt right, the way things sometimes felt right before you could name them. Bud observed all of this with patience and a particular quietness. He made tea. He made the occasional remark that contained a great deal more than it appeared to. Once in February, when Clem had gone to get something from her room, and Foster and Bud were sitting at the kitchen table with their mugs, Bud said, without preamble, "She's never had much. She doesn't know how to want things she can't have, so she doesn't. That's not always going to be true." Foster looked at him. "She's starting to want things," Bud said. He looked at his mug. "That's your doing. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying be careful you can follow through on what you're making her believe is possible." Foster sat with that for a long time after he drove home. He thought about Rosalind, about all the things he'd made her believe were possible and then been absent for, about the way she'd said that's actually better when he said he was working on it, because she'd been calibrated by experience to expect less. He called his company's lawyer the next day. He set up an education trust. He didn't tell Clem. Not yet. He needed to be sure he was doing it for the right reasons, and he was still working that out. Spring came slowly, the way it always did in that part of the country, negotiating with the cold for weeks before it got permission to stay. The creek behind the Aldermere property ran high with snowmelt, and Clem told Foster that she'd been watching the water table near the barn, and she thought the foundation of the barn was compromised on the south side, and that if anyone wanted to save the structure, they'd have better luck starting from the inside. "You want to save the barn?" Foster asked. She looked at him with the particular expression she deployed when people asked questions she'd already answered. "Someone should," she said. "It's been there since 1891, the date's carved in the lintel." Foster looked at the barn. He thought about a Tuesday in October, cold air, a child's voice saying, "Hold on." "What would it take?" he asked. She'd already worked this out. Of course she had. She talked him through it, the foundation repairs, the timber work, the roof, the sequence. He listened, not because he was humoring her, but because she was correct about the sequence, and he'd been in the industry long enough to know the difference between someone who understood structure and someone who'd memorized talking points. "You've drawn it up?" he asked. "I've been drawing it up since January," she said. "I was going to show you when it was ready." She was 11 years old. She had been designing a structural renovation since January. He thought about the carport in 1987, Bud, reading plans from a magazine. He thought about how some things go down through people. The investigation into the kidnapping concluded that spring. Darnell Morrow was charged and the trial was set for the following autumn. Foster gave his statement, reviewed the evidence, did what was required. He thought about Morrow sometimes, about the man who had felt wronged enough to do what he'd done, about the clean signature on the termination papers that Foster had sent off without thinking about what was on the other side of it. He didn't have clean answers about that. He had the question, which was something. He had made changes at the company, the kind that didn't make the papers, how terminations were handled, who was in the room, what support was offered. His CFO had looked at him slightly differently after those conversations. Not badly, just differently. One morning in May, he drove to Garrett Lane to drop off a set of engineering textbooks from a contact at Waterloo, and Bud was on the porch with his coffee and the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting. "She told me about the trust," Bud said. Foster went still. "I was going to tell you myself?" "I know." Bud wrapped both hands around his mug. "She found the letter. I'm not angry about it. She's not angry about it either. She cried a little, but don't tell her I told you that." "I won't," Foster said. Bud was quiet for a moment. The creek was audible from here in the spring, running full. She said, "Why is he doing this?" And I said, "I think because he's trying to be the kind of person who would have walked into that barn." Foster looked at him. "I told her, some people don't know what they could be until something forces the question," Bud said, "and then the ones worth knowing do something about the answer." He looked at his coffee. "I'm going to invite you to stay for breakfast." Foster stayed. In June, the Aldermere barn became a small but notable project. Foster's company donated the materials. Clem drafted the plans, real ones, which Pat reviewed and marked up, and sent back with notes and then reviewed again, and at the end said to Foster, without making a thing of it, "These are solid. She's got it." A local carpenter named Graham took on the physical work, teaching Clem what she wanted to know about the timber joinery on weekends while the spring stretched into summer. Bud came out on Saturdays with his cane and his coffee and sat on a folding chair and watched. And sometimes he and Graham talked about 1987 and what the carport had taught him and what Graham would have told him differently. The barn took 4 months. It did not become something gleaming or restored in the way of a photo spread. It became what it had been, minus the collapse, gray boards and timber structure, and a roof that did its job, with new windows cut into the south side where Clem had said the light came in the best, and a door that opened properly, and the date, 1891, cleaned and visible in the lintel where it had always been. On the day they finished, Clem stood inside and looked up at the light coming through the new windows in long slanted bars, different from the broken roof light of October, but related to it. "It worked," she said, not with surprise. She'd known it would work. She'd designed it to work. "Yes," Foster said. She looked at him. She was 12 now, had been since March, and something in her face had shifted slightly in the year since October. Not that the steadiness was gone, but that it had more room in it somehow, like a door that opened properly. "Are you okay?" she asked him. "Actually," He thought about the barn in October, the trunk, Bud's kitchen, the drive to Goderich, Rosalind on the phone for an hour and a half. Working on it, he said. Clem nodded as if that were the right answer, which he had come to understand it was. Outside, Bud was in his folding chair in the summer afternoon, his cane propped beside him, his face turned to the sun. The creek ran quieter now in the dry season, and the grass had come in green around the barn where it had been bare earth all year, and the light over the fields was the long golden light of an Ontario summer evening that comes in slowly from the west and stays a little longer than you expect, the way good things sometimes do.